Here's how we're going to start our final episode, which should really be the gut punch. This should be the thing that we are leading up to. It should give us the kick in the solar plexus and then the downward slope. That's good storytelling. Not here. CNN is not known. They're not in the business of good storytelling. Okay. So we're going to begin with an oft-told myth that if you listen to it closely enough, what these people are saying is it's our fault. It's our fault that the public adored JFK Jr. so much and gave him not just fame, unearned fame, but cultural currency he had never really earned. That's our fault. Yeah, it's us. It's the simpletons among us out here, the knuckle draggers who are like, oh, it's JFK Jr. Okay, so listen to two of John's friends, Gary Ginsberg and Steve Gillen, elucidate that point.
I never understood why he needed to take up flying. I said to him, like, John, come on. Like, I know you pretty damn well. It's not your sweet spot. And he said to me really interestingly, it's the only place where I can go where I'm left entirely alone. I love the silence. I love the solitude. It was a pure escape for him. How do you argue with that?
Well, he was a moron, so it's pretty easy.
One of the things I did not know about John was how difficult that last year of his life was. The magazine is failing. John is lying around trying to find investors. His marriage was falling apart.
JFK Jr. and new wife headed for Splitsville after just 4 months.
It seems to kind of be a typical tiff of things that go on between the two of them.
And his best friend and cousin, Anthony Radziwill, was dying.
I don't know what that gossip columnist Flo Anthony was saying there. I don't know why they inserted it. She said after the fight and like the public fight we all saw in the last episode of The Nerve and the reports that after 4 months of marriage, his marriage was like going to fall apart and they were going to get divorced 4 months. She says, I don't know, it seemed like a typical tiff they were having. Which is it? It can't be. I don't know why she's here. She's useless. I'm sorry. She's useless. So John says to Gary Ginsberg, who's like, I'm just going to make it clear to you guys, like, I knew him pretty well. I would say to him, hey, John, I knew you pretty well. I mean, there's star fucking the corpse. I mean, there's not even a corpse, the cremains. Can you star fuck cremains? If you can, Gary Ginsberg and Steve Gillen are doing it. I mean, Carole's number one. Would never take that away from her now. He says, John said, it's the only place I can go to be alone, an airplane. What about your house? Like, what about your fucking loft? Your multi-million-dollar loft in Tribeca, or a car, or a boat, or a 5-star hotel, or a private island. I mean, there are a myriad of examples, but nope. Okay, it's got to be a fucking airplane. That's John's logic. Now, Carole, I'm going to spare you the clip, but she goes on to say, ungrammatically, again, this is another one of our bête noirs at the Nerve. She's like, I'm a New York Times bestselling author. Did you know I was a reporter? I was a reporter at ABC News. I mean, the dinosaurs may have been roaming the earth, but I was a reporter. And she goes on to say, now John is dead. And she says, in talking head interview in the CNN documentary that, quote, John will forever love flying. So she's using the present tense and she's saying, sans irony or any kind of self-awareness, John will forever love flying. Well, sweetheart, he won't, because he killed himself and his wife and her sister flying a plane he had no business flying. She also updates her narrative by telling us that John couldn't understand Carolyn because he was a, quote, very privileged male. So she's using the woke lexicon of today. He was a male. He was privileged. He was very privileged. She forgot to say white. Carole, you forgot to say white. Next time, okay, sister? But the producers are sure to tell us this is great. This is where they really shiv their subjects and they like tell us they're kind of on our side over here. They make sure to tell us that Carole's former mother-in-law, Lee Radziwill, didn't like Carolyn. So we're getting like a little truth. I don't think she liked Carole much either. Now, key to John's psyche and emotional state at this time. And CNN does a really poor job of placing us anywhere along the timeline. Like we're just supposed to understand. But if you're going to talk about the weeks and days and hours leading up to this fatal plane crash, if I'm a criminal prosecutor, I've got a timeline that's down to the millisecond, okay? Because we're building the case as to why this guy plummeted that plane into the Atlantic Ocean. So his magazine is failing, okay? And it had been failing almost since it launched. You know, people bought the first issue out of curiosity. What would it be like? JFK Jr. is sort of, finally got himself a job and he founded a magazine and apparently he's got stuff to say. He did not, okay? You need to have stuff to say if you're going to want to have a media platform, have something to say. There's another Beta Kennedy who's struggling mightily with that right now. Anyway, as discussed, George was boring and unreadable. Okay. He had to lower himself to appear on talk shows, to flog this thing that nobody wanted. I guess 2 days at magazine school, the learning annex, how to start your own magazine, 2 days. I guess it didn't teach him everything he needed to know. But let's listen to Carole spinning John's hubris and entitlement, his surety that by dint of his fame, George would be a raving, unqualified, constant success that would only grow bigger and better. And Carole does so by using some very fancy millennial Silicon Valley adjacent jargon.
He was right at a crossroads of saving his magazine. I think because it was new, and like anything that's new and different, people are a little skeptical, and it's a startup business, right? I think people understand what that is more now. There's he was an entrepreneur.
Oh, thanks, Carole.
Business, and I think it was at an inflection point where people weren't quite sure, is this going to be something?
You can hear her literally try to speed up. She's trying to paper over all the holes. And then she's like, well, it was a startup. It was a startup business. And people understand what a startup is now more than they used to. Not so. Everybody understands what a startup is. You fuckwit. Okay. And then she's like, it was at an inflection point. She says inflection point earlier in the episode too about Carole. It's like this garbage language that means nothing. What kind of inflection point, Carole? Were we heading upwards or downwards? Because it was down. Okay. And, it's not our fault that nobody wanted to save this magazine because it really was unreadable, and titans of the industry are going to speak a bit later, and some of them are going to get honest. Not all, some. Among the ones who are not, magazine legend Tina Brown. I'm very disappointed in you, Tina. I loved Vanity Fair under your tenure. I thought what you did with the New Yorker was incredible. And I loved the Vanity Fair Diaries. I'm hoping for the New Yorker Diaries. And I was very, very disheartened to see you lower yourself and giving a tortured explanation as to why John Kennedy Jr. refused, and should be forgiven for, refused to cover the biggest political scandal of the 20th century, a scandal that made Watergate look like a rounding error.
But he was also editing in the era of Bill Clinton. And the biggest story around Bill Clinton was Monica.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. Thank you.
And he didn't want to go there because he was too much of a gentleman.
Oh, he didn't want to go there because he was too much of a gentleman. A gentleman who we're talking about killing his wife and her sister. That's a gentleman. He was not a gentleman, okay? He didn't want to touch it because it was a third rail for him. And then he'd have to answer all these questions about his father's philandering, which back then, what people knew about it was really actually almost it was almost toothless. I mean, we know a lot more now, but he wouldn't have had to answer for that much. You cannot be in media and not run towards controversial topics. But okay, so Tina says that John was too much of a gentleman. Allow me please to read from Forever Young, Billy Noonan's New York Times bestselling book about his lifelong friendship with JFK Jr. I have it right here. Again, it's part of my library of books I used in researching and reporting Ask Not. This is from page 185. Billy and John are arguing about the Clinton Lewinsky scandal. And Billy says, it's disgusting that Clinton was getting orally serviced by a young intern in the Oval Office. And John said, I quote, "Hey, Billy, I've been under that desk and there's barely enough room down there for a 3-year-old, never mind a fat ass like Monica Lewinsky." That was what John thought of Monica. Not that she was in the center of a media maelstrom or that he should try to get the first interview. Like, knock Barbara Walters out of the way. You probably could have got it. But She was a fat ass. Okay, Tina. And just a side note about this doc, CNN, they devoted way too much time to the Clinton Lewinsky scandal. It is not a documentary about that, you guys. This stuff is filler. It's all filler, no killer. Literally. Next, the rightly celebrated magazine editor Kurt Anderson takes Tina's excuse out back where it belongs and shoots it squarely between the eyes before both of them are asked to read from one of John's editor's letters. Let's go.
That should have been like the story for George magazine in 1998. It just should have been. But God almighty, what a mistake. I mean, was it like, oh no, that's too undignified? Well, dude, you started this magazine that is about the undignified nature of stars and starlets and celebrity that have nothing to do with the substance of politics. Why is this the line you draw now? Are politicians celebrities? These days, politicians, like celebrities, are as newsworthy for their private conduct as they are for their public duties.
So why do we hold them to a higher standard than the other glitterati who are famous for being famous? And don't
like me, George Jr.
Politicians are role models. That solemn fraud is obsolete.
There is no way, first of all, no way John wrote that letter. He didn't write those editor's letters. His friend Steve here in this documentary did. And remember, as I told you guys before, he would call Stevie up at like 9:00 the night before and go, "Hey, Stevie, it's your pal, John Kennedy Jr. Hey, why don't you just do me a solid? Why don't you write my editor's letter for me? You know what? It's going to the printer tomorrow, so I need it by 7 a.m. Cool, thanks, bye." And he would do it. And there's no way in hell, I'm sorry, that John Kennedy Jr., who published rather an editor's letter that I was Steve like kind of shivving him a little bit, saying like, why are we talking about politicians in the same way we talk about people who are famous for being famous without accomplishing anything, which describes John to a T. There's no way he came up with that phrase, solemn fraud. No fucking way. Sorry. Okay, so now I'm going to say we're about 25 minutes into this episode, including commercials, because I watched it on linear TV. And what are we still not talking about? What's the elephant in the room that we still haven't gotten around to? And the clock is ticking. It's our last episode. I'm just going to say, I could give you 3 solid hours on that plane crash alone. That's how much uncovered stuff there is. I could do a whole hour on how awful and how utterly vile the Kennedys were to Carolyn and Lauren's mother after that crash. And since CNN won't, I will. Okay? I'll do your fucking job for you. I'm going to read the relevant passage from my book. Okay? Ask not. The Kennedys and the women they destroyed. You want the real story? It's in here. Okay, page 284. Ted Kennedy, after the crash, rushed in to do damage control. He had the remains hastily autopsied, the medical examiner's report and photos sealed. I believe they were burned. Then arranged for cremation. The Kennedys had little compassion for Carolyn and Lauren's family. John's sister Caroline and her husband Ed showed not the slightest remorse or kindness to Anne Freeman. She had lost 2 of her 3 daughters. Lauren's twin sister, Lisa, was now the sole surviving child. Anne was terrified that the Kennedys would use their power to bury what remained of Carolyn and Lauren at the Kennedy family plot in Brookline, Mass. That's Massachusetts, sorry for you guys who aren't in America. Anne wanted her girls close to her in Connecticut, and she needn't have worried because the Kennedys told Anne they did not care. John's remains, however, belonged to them, and he would be buried separately in Brookline. Even Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I am no fan, you guys know, was horrified, as he wrote in a diary entry, dated July 19th, 1999. The agenda for the day was to get Caroline and Anne together without intermediaries so there wouldn't be too many cooks in the kitchen. When Anne came down to New York City, however, Anne had to travel. They didn't go to her. You go to them. Caroline didn't show. Instead, she sent her husband, Ed, and Vicky Reggie, Ted's second wife. All the Bissett family knows that Ed hated Carolyn and did everything he could to make her life miserable. And we know what that's about. He probably wanted to, he probably wanted her, and he couldn't have her. Okay, so Ed hated Carolyn, made her life miserable. RFK in this entry goes on to say he bullied the shattered, grieving mother. They told her that John would be buried in Brookline and that they could do with Carolyn as they pleased. The fucking hubris. Oh, you could do with your own daughter whatever you like. We give you permission. Carol's not talking about that here in this documentary. I mean, Carolyn was her best friend, right? I mean, sister. They were like sisters, really, like family. Like, I don't want to belabor the point, but I just want to make sure because it's really important to Carole that they were not just best friends, but they were sisters. They were family. And Carolyn was like practically a Kennedy by osmosis, But if Carol's really this fucking close to Carolyn, how is she not talking about how wronged her best friend / sister wife's mother was done by the Kennedys? We don't talk about that, do we, Carole? Or why isn't Carole talking about Carolyn's real sister, her actual biological sister, Lauren, who died next to her in that plane? I guess Lauren doesn't count because she wasn't famous. She was a relative, right? I mean, Lauren, John was her brother-in-law. They were the real in-laws, not you, Carole, who's always like, John was my cousin. John was my cousin because I was married to Anthony. Carole's fucking insane, okay? She's insane. And I hope she keeps giving these interviews until her mouth, everything just gives out, because every time she opens her mouth, she makes herself look more and more ridiculous and frankly, just delusional. It is full on Baby Jane over here. Okay, we are in full Norma Desmond flower. Now, to my point. Here, Carole is going to talk about that summer of 1999 and her husband Anthony's imminent death from cancer that he had been fighting for years. Okay, it was very clear this was going to be his final summer. And you would think that would be the biggest tragedy, but it's not. Okay, so let's listen to Carole. And if you can, watch this part of the show because you have got to see the facial expressions and the emotion as it crosses her face. Here we go.
John was resigning to the fact that Anthony was likely not going to make it back to the city at the end of the summer. And then John broke his foot. That was just a disaster.
Oh my God. John broke his foot. It was a disaster. And we're looking up at the heavens and our tears are coming and we're reliving this trauma. John broke his foot in a wholly preventable crash. Again, he flew this thing, a contraption that all of his friends called the flying lawnmower. Everybody was like, stop going up in that thing. You're going to kill yourself. And he kept fucking doing it. And she calls it a fluke that he broke his foot. He's lucky that's all he broke. You know what the real thing that Carole's freaked out about over here is because Carolyn called her, she says, and Carolyn was freaking out because breaking his foot meant that John was going to be in a cast for 2 months. He wouldn't be able to walk or run or bike around town or rollerblade or bicycle with his rollerblades on. Like we know he liked to do, that idiot. And if he couldn't move around, he'd be a nightmare. She'd be stuck with this guy. at home all the time, and he'd be like crawling out of his skin like an addict because he had like ADHD and he couldn't sit still. He couldn't be inside his own mind for one fucking second. If you're telling me the guy like flying so he could sit alone with his own thoughts and really think through stuff, that guy didn't think for a second. He didn't have any deep thoughts. He didn't know himself. He didn't care to know himself. He was famous. He was hot. What's the point? Okay, now. John goes on Larry King Live. I don't know how many times he went on, but CNN is really making a meal out of this. They're just making a meal out of all of their own archival footage. You would think that CNN was the only news outlet that covered John Kennedy Jr. So Larry asks John the question, are there downsides to being you, to having your name and your legacy? Now watch closely. Again, this part of the show I would implore you to watch because John's micro expressions tell the truth. His micro expressions are the real feeling. And you can tell, no pun intended, Larry hit a real nerve here.
There are other days you say, I wish my name were David.
No, I'm pretty happy with what it is. I mean, if you're asking if it's hard being me,
it's brought you a unique life.
Absolutely. And great opportunities and some challenges. But all in all, I feel very fortunate. So it's not so bad.
That was the party line. But you can tell the guy, again, as I said, had zero introspection because Larry asked that question, which I don't think any of his friends ever asked him. Like, I don't think they ever sat down and really had real heart-to-hearts because they were all, no matter how long they knew him or how close they got, they were all still in awe that they knew JFK Jr. So you see John's face, like you see his is it his left eye? It like twitches a little bit and he gulps a little bit. Like it's small, but there's like two gulps. And he goes back like that. And like, you can tell it's like, yeah, what would life be like if I could just, I don't know, what would it like to be like a normal person? You know, that for him was like as far afield for any of us knowing what it's like to live in that kind of a fishbowl. Now, Carole lets something else slip, and I don't think she recognizes its magnitude. Okay. Listen to this.
John was also trying to save his magazine. And Carolyn was trying to help, but then like being frustrated at him because he wasn't acknowledging at that point in the beginning of the summer that Anthony was dying and that he needed to focus and spend time with Anthony.
So what she's really saying, and I don't even think Carole realizes this either because she's as deep as like a fucking kiddie pool. That is how selfish and narcissistic and childish and entitled America's Prince really was. Okay. And I write about this in the book. If he didn't want to deal with something, even the imminent death of a cousin he adored and considered a brother, he just didn't deal with it. He didn't deal with it. He didn't want to. He didn't have to. He didn't care. Nobody ever held him to account except his mother, and she was dead. Okay. There was no thought that John gave to what Anthony may have needed or wanted from John during that time while he is facing down his imminent mortality and knowing he would not make it out of that summer alive. And Anthony was only 40 years old when he died. That is young. But that's the Kennedys for you. They're so fucked up. This documentary, again, would have you believe that this is American royalty. And listen, we're hearing from the people who are in the inner circle, like, no, we're not. Carole's as close as it maybe gets. But I do think, again, she was limited. She was on a need to know basis, you know? And so Anthony is emaciated, scars all over his body. He dies 3 weeks after that plane crash. And RFK Jr. wrote about both of the funerals in his diaries. Now, again, this is how fucked up it is when you're a Kennedy. This is where your head's at. I'm not saying all of them, but like RFK Jr. in his diaries wrote about first, obviously, because this happened first, John and Carolyn unexpectedly, and Lauren predeceased Anthony. He writes about how the streets of New York City were lined with thousands of mourners, like people, just strangers who didn't know John or Carolyn, and the hordes of the media. And anytime they tell you they don't like it, they're lying. They love it. He couldn't believe it. He was like, whoa, like the world's media is here for John and Carolyn. All right, we got to show their lives mattered. That's the only metric, right? Is the media outside your door? And then he writes about Anthony's service like three and a half weeks later out in East Hampton, which was so much smaller, and there was no press. The press didn't care, and they don't come out here unless they're invited. So, you know, but that was the takeaway for Bobby Jr., that John and Carolyn, even in death, drew the bigger crowd. Honeylove is an independent, female-founded brand, and all Honeylove products are intelligently designed by women who actually wear them, including founder Betsy, who is highly involved in the development of each product. Honeylove bras are supportive and wire-free, thanks to bonding technology that lifts without underwire. You deserve a bra that is lightweight and comfortable without sacrificing support. Honeylove shapewear is designed to move with you, not against you, and uses targeted compression to enhance your curves instead of squeeze them. It is all designed to work with your body. Treat yourself to the most advanced bras and shapewear on the market, and you can save 20% off Honeylove at honeylove.com/nerve. Use our exclusive link to get 20% off. honeylove.com/nerve to find your perfect fit. After you purchase, they will ask you where you heard about Honeylove, so please support the Nerve and tell them that we sent you, that you are a troublemaker sent by us. Experience the new standard in bras and shapewear with Honeylove.